The wood of her front door shuddered under the force of the blows. Each impact was a physical jolt to Althea's nervous system, a percussive punctuation to a week of escalating dread. This was not a knock. It was an assault. The sound was thick with entitlement, a brutalist fist demanding entry into her quiet, ordered life. She stood in the center of her small living room, the book she'd been reading lying forgotten on the floor. Her heart was not racing. It had found a low, exhausted thrum that felt heavier, somehow, than panic. This was the culmination. The logical endpoint of a battle she had been fighting in silence for 2 weeks. What happens next will change everything. The world Althea knows is about to be shattered and rebuilt. Subscribe to see how this unfolds. She had graded the paper honestly. That was the beginning and the end of her crime. Jason Thorne had submitted an essay on The Great Gatsby that was a patchwork of plagiarized analysis, stitched together with the clumsy fingers of someone who believed effort was for other people. Althea, who could spot the ghost of another writer's voice from 100 paces, had seen it instantly. She had run it through the university's software as a matter of procedure. The result was a crimson tide of highlighted text, 87% unoriginal. She gave him a 0, as was the stated policy in her syllabus, a document as clear and unyielding as her belief in academic integrity. The failing grade dropped Jason's average from a precarious C to an F. For a boy coasting toward graduation on the gilded rails of his father's influence, it was an existential threat. The first email had arrived within an hour. It was from Marcus Thorne. It was not polite. It spoke of misunderstanding, of a sensitive boy under pressure. It suggested a clerical error. Althea had replied with professional courtesy, attaching the plagiarism report and a copy of her syllabus. She explained the grade was final. That had been the opening salvo. The emails that followed shed their skin of civility, becoming raw, angry demands. Then came the phone calls, his voice a rasp of indignation and veiled threats against her career. He had not updated the file on her. He was working from a version of Althea Reynolds that had never been accurate, the version that saw her as a public servant, a cog in a machine he could easily manipulate. He could not conceive of a world where a teacher, a black woman no less, would not buckle under the weight of his displeasure. He saw her position, not her person. He saw her silence as fear, not fortitude. The school's principal, a man whose spine was made of gelatin, had called her into his office. He had spoken of the school's relationship with Mr. Thorne, a significant donor. He had used words like nuance and reconsideration. Althea had listened, her hands folded in her lap. When he was finished, she had simply said, "The grade stands." She did not raise her voice. She did not plead her case. She stated a fact. The principal had looked at her with a kind of baffled pity, as if she were a lamb volunteering for the slaughter. Now, the slaughter had arrived at her door. The fist hammered again, harder this time. "Althea Reynolds, I know you're in there! Open this door!" Marcus Thorne's voice was a muffled roar, distorted by the wood, but losing none of its venom. She could hear other doors in the hallway opening a crack, the scuttling feet of curious neighbors. Humiliation was part of the strategy. It was a tool meant to isolate and weaken. She thought about calling the police. But what would she say? That a parent was angry about a grade? It felt flimsy, even as the doorframe groaned. Her reality felt bifurcated. On one side, the quiet professionalism of her world, and on the other, this raw, primal aggression that refused to acknowledge rules or boundaries. She looked around her apartment. It was her sanctuary. Bookshelves climbed to the ceiling, a testament to a life lived in language. A single orchid, a difficult, beautiful thing she had nursed into bloom, sat on her windowsill. It was a space of peace, earned and curated over years, and he was trying to break it down. A new sound joined the assault. A splintering crack. He was damaging the door now. This crossed a line. This was no longer about a grade. It was about possession, about a man trying to impose his will on a woman who had dared to say no. A cold clarity settled over her. The exhaustion receded, replaced by something hard and bright. Anger. She had been so tired of fighting, but his violence was a strange kind of stimulant. It reminded her what was at stake. Not a grade, not a job, herself, the quiet sovereignty of her own life. She walked to the door. Her hand was steady as she reached for the deadbolt. Her neighbors might be listening, but they were not the audience she was concerned with. The only person she needed to answer to was herself. She would not cower behind a door he was splintering. She would face him. She drew a breath, the air tasting of dust and ozone, and turned the lock. She opened the door herself. Marcus Thorne stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him into the space he had been trying to breach. He was a large man, softened by wealth, but still physically imposing. His face was a mask of crimson rage. Behind him, crowding the hallway, were not 10 men, but 4. They were large enough to feel like 10. They wore black jackets and expressions of blank professionalism. They were hired intimidation. Their presence meant to shrink her world to the size of a single terrified choice. Thorne regained his balance, a sneer twisting his lips. Finally. I was about to lose my patience. He glanced past her into the apartment, saw his eyes cataloging her life and finding it wanting. We're going to fix this, you and I, right now. Althea did not move. She stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel guarding the border of her life. There is nothing to fix, Mr. Thorne. The grade is not a negotiation. Her voice was low, devoid of the tremor she thought she might feel. It was as if the rage had burned away all the lesser, weaker feelings. His eyes narrowed. He was not used to this. He was used to capitulation. Don't you understand? He hissed, stepping closer, invading her personal space. My son's future is on the line because of your arrogance. A little ink on a piece of paper. That's all it takes. We can go to your school right now, get into your classroom, and you can change the grade in the system. Then this all goes away. No, she said, one word. It hung in the air between them, a solid thing. The sneer collapsed into pure fury. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. You don't say no to me. The pressure was immense. Pain, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. She did not scream. She did not cry out. She met his gaze, and in her eyes was not fear, but a profound, damning pity. He had not updated the file. He was working from a version of her that had never been accurate, and the error was about to become catastrophic. Let go of my arm. The command did not come from her lips. The voice was male, calm, and carried a resonance that seemed to absorb all other sound in the hallway. It was steady as iron wrapped in silk. Marcus Thorne froze, his head snapping toward the source of the sound. The 4 men behind him, all who had been watching the confrontation with detached interest, suddenly stood straighter. Their blankness sharpened into something else. Alertness, recognition. Standing at the end of the hall, by the brushed steel doors of the elevator, was a man. He had not been there a moment before. It was as if he had materialized from the shadows, a figure cut from a different reality. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed to drink the flat, fluorescent light of the corridor. He was perfectly still. He did not rush. He was not performing. His presence was a fact, like gravity. Thorne, caught off guard, his hand still clamped on Althea's arm, blustered. Who the hell are you? This is a private matter. The man's eyes, a dark, intelligent gray, did not flicker toward Thorne. They were fixed on the hand wrapped around Althea's arm. He took a single, unhurried step forward. The clack of his leather-soled shoe on the linoleum was the only sound. It was the kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles. I will not ask you again, the man said, his voice still low, yet it filled the space entirely. It was not a threat. It was a statement of impending consequence. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Thorne's face. This was not part of the script. This man did not look like a neighbor. He did not look like a cop. He looked like power, the real kind. The deep, quiet, structural power that Thorne only pretended to have. The men behind Thorne exchanged a look. One of them, a man with a scarred eyebrow, gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. It was a warning. Abort. Thorne, blinded by his own rage, ignored it. This is none of your business. This woman works for me, for all intents and purposes. She has an obligation. She has no obligation to you, the man interrupted. He took another step. He was halfway down the hall now. But your men have an obligation to their own self-preservation. I suggest they exercise it. His gaze finally shifted, sweeping over the four large men. He did not seem to see them as threats. He seemed to see them as furniture that was in the wrong place. The man with the scarred eyebrow spoke, his voice a low rumble. "Mr. Thorne, let's go." "We're not going anywhere," Thorne snarled, but his grip on Althea's arm loosened slightly. Doubt had found a crack in his fury. The man in the suit stopped. He was perhaps 10 feet away. He looked directly at the scarred man. "You work for Sterling Security. Do you not?" The scarred man's eyes widened slightly. "I had a conversation with Robert Sterling this afternoon. He assured me his men were professionals. He would be very disappointed to learn they were involved in harassing a private citizen in her home. Disappointed enough to terminate your firm's contract and your employment." The blood drained from the scarred man's face. This wasn't a guess. This was a man who had conversations with Robert Sterling. The four men looked at each other. The decision was instantaneous and unanimous. They turned and walked away, not with fear, but with the brisk efficiency of a calculated business decision. They got into the elevator without a backward glance, leaving Marcus Thorne alone in the hallway, his hired muscle, his performance of power, gone. Thorne was left sputtering, so his hand finally falling from Althea's arm. The sudden vacancy of the hall, the quiet, the sheer implausibility of what had just happened left him disarmed. He looked from the closed elevator doors to the man in the suit, his face a mess of confusion and rage. "What did you do? Who are you?" The man, Julian Vance, finally looked at him. And for the first time, Althea saw a flicker of something cold and dangerous in those gray eyes. "I'm the man who owns the building you're trespassing in. I'm the man who holds the debt on your primary company. And I'm the man who is telling you that you are done here." He pulled his phone from his pocket with a fluid motion and pressed a single button. "Security." Within 30 seconds, 2 uniformed building security guards appeared, moving with a purpose the hired thugs had lacked. They flanked Thorne, who looked between them and Julian Vance, his bravado completely shattered. He had walked into a world whose rules he did not understand and picked a fight with its king. "You can't do this," he stammered, the words hollow. "I already have," Julian said, his voice flat. He turned his attention to Althea, his expression softening immediately. His entire focus narrowed to her, as if Thorne had already ceased to exist. "Are you all right, Miss Reynolds?" The guards took Thorne by the arms. He began to protest, his voice rising in a pathetic whine. "This is harassment. You'll hear from my lawyer." Julian didn't even look at him. His eyes were on the red marks blooming on Althea's skin where Thorne's fingers had been. "Take him out," he said, his voice dropping again to that lethally quiet tone. The guards began to march the sputtering Marcus Thorne down the hallway. His final, impotent shout, "This isn't over!" was cut off by the closing of the elevator doors. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was deep and heavy, filled with the weight of what had just occurred. Althea stood in her doorway, her arm throbbing, her mind reeling. She looked at the man before her, a stranger who knew her name, a man who had dismantled her tormentor with a few quiet words and the invisible levers of immense power. He did not move closer. He maintained the respectful distance, his hands at his sides. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with a profound, almost solemn respect. "Miss Reynolds," he said again, his voice gentle. "May I offer you a safer place to spend the night?" The question hung in the air. It was not a proposition. It was a lifeline. Althea looked from his calm, steady face to the splintered wood of her door, the symbol of her violated peace. She thought of the sleepless nights to come, the fear that would now be a permanent resident in her home. She looked back at him, this quiet sovereign who had appeared from nowhere. She did not know who he was, not really, but she knew what he was not. He was not Marcus Thorne. He was not performing. He was offering sanctuary, and in that moment, she was too tired to refuse. Yes, she said, the word a quiet surrender. Not to him, but to the reality that her life had irrevocably changed. He nodded once, a small accepting gesture. My car is downstairs. Please, take your time. Gather what you need. He did not rush her. He simply waited, a still point in her spinning world. Althea stepped back into her apartment, the scent of her books and her single blooming orchid a fragile comfort, and began to pack a small bag, wondering who this Julian Vance was and why he had come for her. The ride in his car was like being sealed in a vault of silence and dark leather. The city slid past the tinted windows, its noise and chaos reduced to a distant silent film. Althea sat in the back, her overnight bag at her feet. Julian sat beside her, though he maintained a careful distance, leaving a neutral territory of plush upholstery between them. He had not spoken since they'd left her building, allowing her the space to process. The silence wasn't empty. It was patient. Althea broke it first. Her voice was steady. A teacher's voice, accustomed to asking direct questions. You know my name. You own my building. You seem to know a great deal about Marcus Thorne. I think I deserve to know who you are, Mr. Vance. He turned his head slightly, his profile etched against the fleeting city lights. You do, he agreed. His voice was low, a resonant bass that seemed perfectly calibrated to the quiet interior of the car. My name is Julian Vance, and I know you because of my sister Amelia. The name stirred a faint memory. Amelia Vance, a quiet, ferociously bright girl from a decade ago, a student in her advanced placement literature class, a girl who had been struggling, not with the material, but with a crippling lack of confidence. I remember her, Althea said softly. She was a wonderful writer, very gifted. A small, rare smile touched Julian's lips. She is a pediatric surgeon now, at Johns Hopkins. She credits you with that, entirely. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. She was going to drop out of your class. She was convinced she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong. Her grades were slipping. Our parents were concerned. They wanted to intervene, to speak with you, to smooth the path. Althea remembered the parent-teacher conference. The Vances had been wealthy then, too, though she hadn't known the scale of it. They had been polite, but firm, suggesting Amelia was under too much pressure. They wanted her moved to a less demanding class. Althea had refused. I remember, Althea said. I told them Amelia's problem wasn't the pressure. It was that no one had ever told her she was strong enough to handle it. I told them to give me 6 weeks. You did, Julian confirmed. My parents were not pleased. They were accustomed to their requests being met. But you held your ground. You told them that you would not participate in teaching their brilliant daughter that she was fragile. He turned to face her more fully now, and in the dim light she could see the depth of gratitude in his eyes. You spent your lunch periods with her. You gave her books that weren't on the syllabus, books about difficult, resilient women. You didn't coddle her. You challenged her. You saw her, Miss Reynolds, not as a problem to be managed, but as a mind to be forged. By the end of the semester, she was the best student in the class. By the end of the year, she believed she could do anything, and she was right. Althea was quiet for a long moment, the memory returning to her in sharp detail, Amelia's hesitant smile turning into a confident grin, the power of her final essay. It was why she taught, for those moments, for the Amelias of the world. I was just doing my job. No, Julian said, his voice firm. You were doing much more than that. You were practicing your principles in a world that often punishes them. My sister has never forgotten it, and neither have I. He looked away, back at the blur of the city. My family's foundation has been a silent benefactor of the public school system for years. One of our conditions is a quarterly report on personnel matters of integrity. a list of teachers and administrators who hold the line, who do the right thing when it's difficult. Your name has been on that list more than any other. When Marcus Thorne began his campaign against you, it was flagged. When he escalated, I was notified. When I learned he was going to your home tonight, I decided to handle it personally. The sheer scale of it was dizzying. A secret foundation, a list, a decade of quiet observation. She had been seen all this time without ever knowing it. It was a disorienting relief, like discovering you had a guardian angel who was also the CEO of a celestial corporation. So you came because of your sister, she clarified, trying to ground herself in the facts. I came because your integrity is a rare and valuable asset, he corrected gently. It changed my sister's life. I imagine it has changed many others. Assets like that should be protected. Thorne is a liability, a bug in the system. He needed to be removed. He used corporate metaphors, framing a deeply personal act of protection in the cool, detached language of his world. It was both jarring and strangely comforting. The car slowed, turning through a tall wrought iron gate that opened for them silently. A long, tree-lined drive unfolded before them. You cannot go back to your apartment, he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Thorne is a petty, vindictive man. He will not let this go easily. You will stay here at my family's home. You will be safe. They pulled up to a large stone house, warm light spilling from its many windows. It was not a palace, but a home, solid and welcoming against the dark, rainy night. The driver opened her door. Julian was already out, waiting for her. This is a lot, Mr. Vance, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Julian, he corrected. And yes, it is. But it is also necessary, for now. He gestured toward the front door, which was already opening. An older woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled into an elegant chignon stood there, a soft cashmere shawl around her shoulders. She looked at Althea, and her face broke into a warm, genuine smile. You must be Althea, the woman said, her voice rich with warmth. I'm Eleanor Vance, Julian's mother. I've wanted to meet you for 10 years. She stepped forward and without hesitation took Althea's hands in her own. Her grip was soft but firm. Welcome to our home. We are so very glad you are here. Althea looked from Eleanor's kind face to Julian's watchful one. This was his offer of protection, made manifest. It was not just a place to stay. It was an embrace. It was the full, formidable weight of the Vance family, Sar closing ranks around her. For the first time in weeks, she felt the tight knot of fear in her stomach begin to loosen. She was not alone in this fight anymore. She had allies she never could have imagined, and her enemy had no idea what was coming for him. The Vance estate was a world unto itself, a pocket of serene old-world grace nestled just outside the city's frantic pulse. Althea was shown to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment. It was furnished with understated elegance, a 4-poster bed, a small fireplace, and a wall of books that felt like a personal welcome from Eleanor. A vase of fresh orchids, identical to the one on her own windowsill, sat on the mantelpiece, a small, thoughtful detail that spoke volumes. It said, "We see you. We know you." For the first day, she mostly slept, the kind of deep, a boneless sleep that comes after a long period of sustained tension. When she was awake, she drifted through the quiet rooms of the house or sat in the vast, sun-drenched library, a mug of tea warming her hands. Eleanor would find her, not to pry, but to talk about books or gardening or Amelia's latest surgical triumphs. She spoke of Althea's stand against Marcus Thorne not as an act of bravery, but as an act of simple, professional correctness. In the Vance family's worldview, integrity was the baseline expectation. It was Thorne who was the aberration. This quiet, constant validation was more healing than any words of sympathy could ever be. It was the kind of silence that settles, that allows a bruised soul to mend. Julian was a quiet presence. He would leave for the city in the morning, a dark suit his armor, his expression unreadable. He would return in the evening, and they would often share a meal. Althea, Julian, and Eleanor. The conversations were never about Thorn. Julian would ask her about her pedagogical theories, about the challenges of teaching literature to a generation raised on screens. He listened with an unnerving intensity, as if her insights were valuable data points he was entering into a complex equation. He was learning her, not her story, but the architecture of her mind. On the third evening, she found him in his study after dinner. He was standing before a bank of monitors, his back to the door. She hesitated, feeling like an intruder in his command center. He spoke without turning around. "He's filing a lawsuit." Althea stepped into the room. "Thorn?" "Yes." Julian turned. His face was impassive, frivolous. "Of course. Defamation. Intentional infliction of emotional distress upon his son. He's leaking it to a friendly journalist. The story will likely run tomorrow." A familiar, cold dread washed over her. Her name, her professional reputation, dragged through the mud. "What do we do?" The "we" slipped out, unbidden but not unwelcome. "We do nothing," Julian said. "My legal team is already prepared. They will file a motion to dismiss, but that's a countermove. It's defensive. I prefer to be on the offense." He gestured to one of the screens. It showed a complex corporate flowchart. "This is Thorn's primary business, a boutique construction firm, profitable but over-leveraged. He specializes in high-end retail build-outs. 90% of his contracts for the next 2 years are with a single luxury brand, Argento." "And?" Althea asked, not following his line of thought. Julian's expression did not change, but she saw that cold light in his eyes again. "And as of 3 o'clock this afternoon, Vance Holdings owns a controlling interest in Argento's parent company. The board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning. We will be terminating all contracts with Thorn Construction, effective immediately, citing a morals clause regarding the recent conduct of their CEO. Althea stared at him. He had not just built a shield around her, he had begun to systematically dismantle her enemy's entire world. It was ruthless. It was total. And it was being done with the quiet efficiency of a software update. She felt a tremor of something that was not quite fear, but a profound awe at the scale of his power. And a part of her, the part that had been ground down by Thorn's bullying, felt a cold, sharp thrill of satisfaction. "Is that legal?" she asked, the question sounding naive even to her own ears. "Perfectly," he said. "It's just business." She walked closer to the desk, her arms crossed. She had to say it. She had to draw the line for herself, even in this gilded cage. "Julian, I appreciate this, more than I can say. But I am not a damsel in distress. I am not an asset you acquire and protect. I am a person." He met her gaze. He did not look offended. He looked like he had been waiting for this. He nodded. "I know that, Althea. Better than you think." His voice softened. "I watched Marcus Thorn try to break you down for 2 weeks. I watched you stand your ground against him, against your principle, against the entire system that was designed to make you bend. I watched you open your own door to face him. A damsel in distress would have called for help. You prepared for a fight." He paused, his gray eyes holding hers. "I don't leave because things become complicated," he said, echoing words she might have spoken herself. "I am not here because you are weak. I am here because you are strong, and I will not stand by and watch a man like Thorn punish you for it. This isn't me saving you. This is me clearing the board so you can continue your work, the work that matters." It was the most astonishing thing anyone had ever said to her. He saw her strength not just as a virtue, but as a resource worth defending with the full arsenal of his power. He was not her rescuer. He was her ally. A recalibration happened in her mind. This was not dependency. This was a partnership. An unlikely, asymmetrical one, but a partnership nonetheless. He provided the fortress and the artillery. She provided the very thing he was fighting for, the principle. "All right, Julian," she said, her voice clear and strong. What's the next move? A true, unguarded smile broke across his face. It transformed him, chasing the shadows from his eyes. The next move is the Vance Foundation's annual Obsidian Gala. It's in 2 weeks. It's the single most important event on the city's social calendar. Everyone will be there. And you want me to go with you? She finished. I want you to be there as my guest of honor, he said. Thorne will have spent the next 2 weeks watching his world crumble. He will be desperate. He will see your presence at my side as the ultimate provocation. He will do something foolish. You're setting a trap, she said. I am setting a stage, he corrected. Or for his downfall, and for your vindication. She thought about it. Hiding felt safe, but hiding was what Thorne wanted. He wanted her to shrink, to disappear, to stand in the light. At the heart of Julian's world was the opposite of that. It was a declaration that she was not broken, that she would not be erased. I'll need a dress, she said. Althea is finally safe, but Marcus Thorne is about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Drop me in the comments if you think Thorne is going to get what he deserves. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now so you don't miss the moment his world comes crashing down. The 2 weeks leading up to the Obsidian Gala were a masterclass in quiet devastation. Althea witnessed it not directly, but in fragments. A hushed call Julian would take in his study, his voice a low, precise monotone, an email notification she might glimpse on the screen of his assistant, Isabel, a sharp, fiercely competent woman who moved through the Vance estate like a phantom, executing Julian's will before he had even fully articulated it. The news reports began as a trickle, then became a flood. Thorne Construction loses Argento contract in shock move. Prominent developer Marcus Thorne under financial scrutiny. Sterling Bank calls in major loan, citing confidence issues with Thorne's leadership. Marcus Thorne, in his blind arrogance, saw only Althea. He saw the teacher who had defied him, now ensconced with some wealthy new protector. He could not grasp the structural nature of his own ruin. He believed it was all personal, a vendetta orchestrated by this woman who should have been nothing. A footnote in his son's triumphant academic career. His entire worldview was built on a foundation of personal dominance. He was psychologically incapable of understanding that he had been undone by impersonal, market-driven forces, wielded like a scalpel by a man he had never even registered as a threat. He had not updated the file. He was still working from the version where he was the protagonist, the powerful man wronged by an ungrateful subordinate. In a letter from his lawyer to Julian's, a document Julian shared with Althea over breakfast with a look of dry amusement, Thorne's delusion was laid bare. He accused Althea of maliciously manipulating Julian Vance, of using her feminine wiles to turn a respected businessman against him. He demanded a settlement, $10 million, and a public apology from Althea to his son, Jason. He seems warm, Althea had remarked, taking a sip of her coffee. Julian had actually chuckled, a low, surprising sound. He believes he is negotiating from a position of strength. He thinks the lawsuit is leverage. He thinks public shame is a weapon he can still wield against you. And what do you think? She asked. I think, Julian said, folding the letter neatly, that he is about to provide us with the final piece of evidence we need for a countersuit of harassment and extortion. He just needs one last push. The push was the invitation to the Obsidian Gala. Not a real one, of course. Julian's team had let it be known through back channels that Thorne was persona non grata, but Thorne, in his desperation, was predictable. He purchased a ticket from a third-party seller at a wildly inflated price, a broker who was, naturally, on the Vance payroll. Isabel confirmed the transaction with a quiet nod to Julian as she poured him more coffee. He's in. Good, Julian said. During this time, the slow burn of Althea and Julian's connection deepened. It was a relationship built in the quiet spaces. In the library, they debated the merits of Faulkner versus Morrison. He would listen, truly listen, as she spoke about the power of narrative, how stories shape our understanding of the world. She learned that behind his CEO armor was a man who had read Virgil in the original Latin, who found a mathematical beauty in the structure of a sonnet. He was a man of immense layered complexities. She, in turn, began to understand his world. Not the world of high finance, which bored her, but the world of systems. She saw that he viewed society as a vast, interconnected machine. He was not a tyrant who wished to rule it, but an engineer who wished for it to run efficiently and, in his own way, justly. Thorn was a broken cog grinding against the gears, and Julian's actions were simply the process of removing and replacing the faulty part. One evening, she found him staring out at the city lights from the terrace. "Are you always like this?" she asked. "So controlled? So methodical?" He was silent for a moment. "In my world, emotion is a liability. It creates inefficiencies. It leads to miscalculation." He turned to her. "Like Thorn, his rage makes him predictable. His arrogance makes him blind. He will walk into the gala expecting a shouting match. He is bringing a knife to a battle that was won 2 weeks ago with a spreadsheet." "And what about you?" she pressed gently. "Shh, do you ever allow for emotion?" His gray eyes searched her face. "My sister is a surgeon because of you. I feel a great deal of gratitude for that. Protecting the person who made that possible is not an inefficiency. It is the restoration of a moral balance." He paused. "It feels correct." It was the closest he had come to a declaration of personal feeling. It was not a confession of love or even passion. It was something deeper, more solid. It was a statement of alignment. He was aligning his immense power with her unwavering principle. It was a new kind of intimacy, one she had never known. The safety she felt with him was not just physical. It was intellectual. It was ethical. He was the first man who had ever seen her integrity not as a charming quirk or a difficult obstacle, but as her most essential and valuable quality. The day of the gala arrived. A team of stylists, dispatched by Eleanor, appeared at the house. Althea, who was more comfortable in cardigans and sensible shoes, found herself being zipped into an emerald green gown that felt like liquid silk against her skin. It was architecturally precise, elegant, and powerful. When she looked in the mirror, she did not see a stranger. She saw a version of herself she had not yet met, a woman comfortable in the spotlight, a woman who belonged in the rooms of power. Eleanor came in, her eyes shining. "Oh, my dear, you look like a queen." "I feel like an imposter," Althea confessed. "Nonsense," Eleanor said, adjusting a fold in the gown. "An imposter is someone pretending to have worth they do not possess. You are merely dressing to match the worth you have always had." "There is a difference." When she descended the grand staircase, Julian was waiting at the bottom. He was in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, the epitome of dark, quiet authority. He stopped speaking to the man beside him as she appeared. His eyes traveled up the length of her, and for a fleeting, unguarded moment, the cool CEO facade fell away. She saw not just appreciation, but a profound gut punch of raw admiration. He was seeing not just the woman in the dress, but the decade of strength and principle that had brought her to this staircase. He offered her his arm. His touch was light, but the connection was electric. "Are you ready, Althea?" She took a deep breath, the scent of his clean, expensive cologne filling her senses. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. Marcus Thorne thought he was coming for a fight. He thought he was going to expose her. He had no idea he was merely a final, pathetic plot point in a story that was no longer about him at all. "I'm ready," she said. And together, they walked out into the night, toward the stage that had been so carefully set for the final act. The Obsidian Gala was less a party and more a temporary kingdom. It was held in the grand atrium of the Vance Tower, a cathedral of glass and steel that pierced the city skyline. Chandeliers like frozen constellations hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a diamond dust light over the assembled power of the city. The low hum of conversation was a symphony of influence, of deals being made and fortunes being shaped between sips of champagne. Althea felt a flicker of her earlier insecurity, a sense of being out of her depth. But then she felt the steady pressure of Julian's hand on the small of her back, a silent anchor in this glittering sea, and the feeling passed. He did not hide her. He did the opposite. He moved through the room with his usual unhurried grace, introducing her to senators, to bank presidents, to artists and philanthropists. He did not introduce her as his date. He introduced her as my friend, Althea Reynolds. And then he would add something specific. Althea is one of the city's finest educators. Or, Althea and I were just discussing the structural failings of modern philanthropy. He presented her as his peer, an intellectual equal. People, powerful people who could make or break careers with a careless word, listened to her with genuine interest. They saw the respect in Julian's eyes and mirrored it. For the first time in a public setting, she was not being underestimated. She was simply being seen. They were standing near the grand staircase, speaking with an elderly woman who ran the city's largest art museum, when the atmosphere shifted. It was a subtle change, a dip in the ambient temperature of the room. A pocket of silence formed near the entrance and began to spread. Julian, without turning, knew. "He's here," he murmured, his voice for her ears only. Althea's heart gave a single hard thump against her ribs. She turned slowly. There he was, Marcus Thorne. He stood just inside the entrance, his tuxedo slightly rumpled, his face flushed with a toxic combination of alcohol and rage. He was scanning the crowd, his eyes wild and unfocused. He looked like a predator that had stumbled out of its natural habitat and into a world it didn't understand. He looked weak. He spotted them. His eyes locked on Althea and then on Julian's hand, which was still resting lightly on her back. A spasm of pure, primal fury crossed his face. He began to push his way through the crowd, shouldering aside a city councilman and ignoring the indignant gasp of a socialite. He was a disruption, a glitch in the perfect ordered system of the gala. Julian did not move. He simply turned his body slightly, placing himself between Althea and Thorne's line of approach. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was an absolute declaration. "You will have to go through me." Thorne came to a halt before them, his breath coming in ragged pants. The pocket of silence around them was now absolute. The entire gala had become an audience. "There you are!" He spat, his voice a low, vicious snarl. He pointed a trembling finger at Althea. You did this." Althea met his gaze. She felt no fear, only a kind of weary sadness for the sheer, pathetic waste of his anger. "You have an obligation," he shouted, his voice cracking. The performance was for the crowd now. He was trying to cast himself as the victim. "An obligation to my son, to his future. You think you can hide behind him?" He gestured wildly at Julian. "You think his money makes you untouchable? You owe me. You owe my son." He took a lurching step forward, his hand reaching for her, a pathetic echo of the assault in her hallway. Julian moved. It was not a fast motion, but it was final. He stepped directly into the path of Thorne's hand, blocking it with his own body. He did not touch Thorne. He simply occupied the space. "You speak of obligation, Mr. Thorne," Julian said. His voice was not loud, but it was amplified by the unnatural silence of the vast room. Every word landed with the cold, hard impact of a polished stone. "Let's talk about obligations." Julian's gaze was flat, his expression devoid of all emotion. He was no longer an ally or a protector, he was an executioner. You had an obligation to your investors. An obligation you defaulted on when your largest client terminated their contracts. He paused. "That was my doing." Thorne's jaw went slack. A confused, wounded look entered his eyes. "You had an obligation to your lenders," Julian continued, his voice relentless. "An obligation you could no longer meet when your credit lines were frozen. That, also, was my doing." He held up his phone, the screen glowing. On it was a signed document, a deed of transfer. "And you had an obligation to the bank that held the mortgage on your home. As of this afternoon, I am the bank. You are 3 months in arrears. You are being evicted tomorrow." The color drained from Thorne's face. He was no longer red with rage. He was sheet white with a terror so profound it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. The crowd was utterly still, watching the public dissection of a man's life. "And your son," Julian said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it seemed to carry to every corner of the atrium. "His place at the university, the one you were so desperate to secure. The dean of admissions sits on my foundation's board. He was fascinated to read the plagiarism report Miss Reynolds filed. He was even more fascinated by your attempts to coerce an educator. The acceptance has been rescinded, due to ethical concerns. It was the final blow, the one that severed the last thread of Thorne's reality. He had lost his business, he had lost his home, and now he had lost the very thing this entire sordid crusade had been about, his son's unearned future. He had sacrificed everything for nothing. The arrogance, the bluster, the performative power, it all evaporated in an instant. It was never real. It was a costume, and Julian had just stripped it from him in front of the entire world. What was left was a small, broken man. A sound escaped Thorne's throat, a choked, animal sob. His body seemed to collapse in on itself. He dropped to his knees on the marble floor, the sound echoing in the silent room. "Please," he begged. The word, a ragged gasp. He wasn't even looking at Julian anymore. He was looking at the floor, at the wreckage of his life. "Please. My son. Everything. Please." Julian looked down at the weeping man, his expression like a mask carved from ice. "You should have respected his teacher," he said. The words were not an admonishment, they were an epitaph. He gave a small, sharp nod. As if on cue, two of his security staff, dressed in the same dark suits as the gala guests, moved forward. They were not aggressive. They were quiet, efficient, and final. They flanked the kneeling Thorne, lifted him gently but firmly to his feet, and began to guide him toward a side exit. He did not resist. He was sobbing uncontrollably, a man completely and utterly ruined. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a certain grim satisfaction. The king of this small, temporary kingdom had passed judgment, and it was absolute. The moment the doors closed behind Thorne, the silence in the room held for a beat longer. Then Julian turned. He walked to the small podium that had been set up for the evening's speeches and took the microphone. His voice, calm and steady, filled the vast space. "For those of you who witnessed that unfortunate display," he began, his eyes sweeping across the crowd, "allow me to provide some context." He paused, and his gaze found Althea. He held her eyes, and in that look was a universe of respect and apology. An apology for the necessity of this public spectacle. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent question. "Are you ready?" She nodded back, her chin held high. He turned back to the audience. "That man believed he could bully a teacher into sacrificing her principles for his own convenience. He believed his influence was a weapon she could not withstand. He was wrong." He let that sink in. For 15 years, the woman he targeted has been one of the finest educators in this city. She has been a shaper of minds, a mentor to the struggling, and an unwavering bastion of integrity in a system that too often rewards mediocrity. His eyes found Althea again, and he smiled, a genuine, warm smile that lit up his face. "My own family owes her a debt we can never repay. She taught my sister not what to think, but how to think. She gave her the courage to become the brilliant surgeon she is today." He raised his glass. "Her name is Althea Reynolds." A murmur went through the crowd. Names were being connected. The story piecing itself together in the minds of the city's most powerful people. This was not some anonymous teacher. This was the woman who had the personal gratitude and fierce loyalty of Julian Vance. "Integrity like hers is not a weakness," Julian continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "It is the bedrock of a functioning society. It is the most valuable asset we have, and it must be protected. It must be celebrated. It must be empowered." He put down his glass. To that end, the Vance Foundation is announcing our largest ever initiative, a $20 million charter to fund and develop new educational models focused on fostering not just academic excellence, but ethical leadership. The room erupted in applause. Julian held up a hand, waiting for it to subside. An initiative of this importance requires a leader of unimpeachable character and visionary intellect. It requires a chair who has proven, under immense pressure, that their moral compass is true. He smiled again, a broad, proud smile. It is my distinct honor to introduce you to the chair of that charter's board and its chief architect, Miss Althea Reynolds. He extended his hand to her. The applause that followed was deafening. It was a wave of sound, of validation, of public acknowledgement that washed over her. As she walked toward him, moving through the crowd that parted for her as if she were royalty, she felt the last vestiges of her old life fall away. She was no longer the underestimated survivor. She was the celebrated architect. She took Julian's hand and he led her to the podium, to the center of the light. She had been seen. She had been vindicated. And she was finally, truly, safe. Later that night, long after the last guest had departed and the atrium had fallen silent, they stood on a private terrace high up on the Vance Tower. The city spread out below them, a glittering tapestry of light and shadow. The cool night air felt clean, fresh. Althea leaned against the railing, the emerald silk of her gown rustling softly. She took a breath, a long, slow exhale that felt as if it were releasing a decade of tension from her bones. The quiet exhaustion of long-term suffering was finally, blessedly, gone. In its place was a feeling she could barely name. It was not triumph. It was not joy. It was peace. The kind of deep, resonant peace that comes from being correctly placed in the world. Julian stood beside her, not touching, but his presence was a solid, comforting warmth in the darkness. He had taken off his tuxedo jacket and loosened his tie, and in the soft light from the doorway, he looked less like a sovereign and more like a man who had waged and won a quiet, devastating war on her behalf. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. The words felt small, inadequate for the sheer scale of what he had done. "For what?" he asked, his gaze on the distant horizon. "For the trap," she said. "For the stage. For the speech." She turned to look at him. "For seeing me." He finally met her eyes. The coldness was gone, replaced by a warmth that seemed to emanate from deep within. "Seeing you was the easy part, Althea. Believing you would stand your ground was the easy part. The hard part was waiting for the right moment to intervene. My first instinct was to crush him the day he sent the first email." "Why didn't you?" "Because his ruin needed to be public," Julian said simply, "and your vindication needed to be absolute. It wasn't enough for you to be safe. The world needed to know why you were worth protecting." She understood then. It had all been for this, not just to punish Thorne, but to elevate her. To take her quiet, unseen worth and broadcast it to the world. He had not just given her a shield, he had given her a crown. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. His muscles tensed for a moment under her touch, then relaxed. "It was quite a performance," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I'm glad you approve," he said, his own lips twitching into a smile. He covered her hand with his. His fingers were long and warm. It was not a gesture of passion, but of partnership, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in the crucible of the last few weeks. They stood there for a long time, in the comfortable silence, their hands linked, watching the city breathe below them. It was a moment of profound, quiet rightness. A real smile reached her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The months that followed were a whirlwind of purposeful activity. The charter, which she named the Amelia Vance Initiative for Ethical Education, became her life's work. Julian had given her a blank check, but more importantly, he had given her his complete trust. She built her team, hiring brilliant, passionate educators who, like her, had been overlooked or stifled by the rigid public school system. They designed a curriculum from the ground up, one that wove ethics and philosophy into every subject. Julian had a suite of offices for the charter built out in the Vance Tower, adjacent to his own. In the center of it, he had constructed a library that was a bibliophile's dream, with floor-to-ceiling shelves of dark wood, rolling ladders, and comfortable leather armchairs. It was her sanctuary, her command center, her home. Their relationship settled into a new rhythm. It was a partnership in the truest sense of the word. They were a team. He would often wander into the library at the end of his day, his tie loosened, and simply sit, watching her work. Sometimes they would talk for hours, debating policy or philosophy. Other times, they would sit in comfortable silence. The quiet hum of two powerful minds at rest. The slow, respectful development of their romantic relationship was based on this foundation of recognition and safety, not on fleeting passion. It grew organically, an extension of their intellectual and ethical alignment. One evening, she was on a ladder reaching for a high shelf when he came in. He stood at the bottom, watching her, a fond smile on his face. "Do you ever stop?" he asked. "I have a lot of time to make up for," she said, pulling down a heavy volume of educational theory. "I spent a lot of years feeling like I was pushing a boulder uphill. Now, it feels like the hill has flattened." "I didn't flatten the hill," he said, taking the book from her as she descended. "I just took care of the other people who were trying to push the boulder back down on you." She stepped off the ladder and faced him. "That's a very romantic way of saying you bankrupted my enemies." He laughed, a full, genuine laugh that made her heart ache in the best possible way. "Is it working?" "It's not working," she teased. She grew serious, tracing the spine of the book he held. "I don't leave because things become complicated, Julian." She looked up at him. "But I stay because they feel right." He put the book down and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. His gray eyes were dark with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Althea," he said, his voice thick with feeling, "everything with you feels right." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, abiding certainty. It was a kiss that promised not a fairy tale ending, but a real-life beginning, a future built not on fantasy, but on shared principles, mutual respect, and the quiet, daily choice to build a life together. It was the promise of what comes next. Some people will take your silence for weakness and your grace for submission. They will see your integrity as a flaw to be exploited, a naivete to be punished. They build their hollow kingdoms on foundations of arrogance and intimidation, believing their volume equals their value. But true power isn't loud. It's quiet. It's structural. It's the unhurried hand that rewrites the code, that buys the bank, that changes the world not with a shout, but with a signature. And when that quiet power is wielded in the service of quiet strength, kingdoms of arrogance fall. And a new world built on the solid ground of integrity can finally begin. What did you think of Julian's method of dealing with Thorn? Was it justice, or was it overkill? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of vindication and quiet strength moved you, please show your support and hit that like button right now. It helps us bring more stories like this to you, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Hit that button and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. The story of Althea and Julian is just beginning, and the world they are about to build will change everything.